afternoon and welcome back to tonight's episode of Breaking Bread. A couple of house regulations before we get started here. If you do have any comments or questions, please drop them in the chat below and I'll answer what I can from your requests. And tonight we have something a little bit different in store. So instead of preparing a meal, since it's springtime, I was thinking about, okay, what's something that we don't always ponder or question as we're just walking, strolling through town, as COVID restrictions are slowly lifting and more people are getting vaccinated and are moving about and going outside and just participating in the great land that we live in. I thought it'd be great to take a couple minutes and most of an episode to go over a couple of local flora that we might pass by every day that grow on our sidewalks, on our back bay here in Newport Beach, or even in our own backyards. And like I said, instead of a meal, today we're making a tea. That tea is going to be made out of culinary sage. And the handful of flora that we're going to be going over today is going to be fennel, which we have here. We're going to go over seaweed, and like I said, we have some culinary sage here that we'll discuss. I also want to go over some dandelions, and as you saw in our intro video, the prickly pear cactus. So to get started, we'll start with our tea. If you're at home, if you're preparing your meal or food for dinner, please enjoy that as we have a discussion. If you're not, and you're just sitting at your counter or at your table or in your bedroom watching, hanging out, feel free to go make a cup of tea and come back and enjoy the show. So let's get started. So our sage tea recipe is quite simple. There's only 3 ingredients here. We have some honey, and this honey, we'll put on our camera here. This honey is courtesy of the Julian Mountains, Julian Cider Mill in Julian, San Diego. It is made from, what we have here? Orange blossom honey. It is raw honey. Harkening back to our episode we did with Lucky, our friendly beekeeper, we are continuing to find local places that we can support and source local honey to support the bee populations in Southern California. So that's our, not quite a sponsor today, but that's our plug for the afternoon. Our second ingredient is going to be lemons. We're going to use the juice of the lemons, and we're also going to be using a bit of a microplaner to get some of the zest and some of that zing out of the rind. And of course, our sage and some boiling water. So to start, the stems of the sage plant can be a bit bitter, so you can just tear them off. I just put it straight in the cup. This can easily be taken out later with flora plants done steeping. And you can use as much as you'd like. I'm going to use probably 2 or 3 of these bunches here for mine. You're going to want to use about a tablespoon's worth of honey or sugar. The original recipe called for sugar, but I usually prefer honey instead of just putting white sugar in things, especially drinks. I think it adds some flavor to what we're going to be enjoying. And one of the great things about teas is that you get all of the goods in whatever tea you're making without actually having to eat the fibrous plant material. Now, culinary sage is used in many dishes. One of my favorites is a very simple dish that is just Parmesan cheese, brown butter, pasta, and wilted sage. It's delicious, aromatic. You occasionally get some slight umami flavor from the Parmesan cheese in there. That'll be for another evening, another dinner together with all of you here. So to start, we're gonna pour some boiled water over our sage leaves. We're gonna let this steep for several minutes. And our second step, we're gonna zest a bit of our lemons. So we can just use a microplaner here and get some of this in one bowl. You want to be careful you don't go too far into the rind if you're ever zesting a citrus fruit. Because if you get too far past the outer layer, it starts to get very bitter. If you've ever been eating an orange and you bite a bit too far past the actual fruit, you know the bitter taste that you can sometimes get from their citrus fruits. You won't need too much. Zest usually has quite a lot of flavor in it. I'll probably do about a third of our lemon zested here, maybe a bit more, maybe half. Looks like it might be about half. Go ahead and set that aside for now. And then using a spoon or your hands, you can just take some of that zest and tap it on in and give it a gentle agitation. And if you don't particularly like having any loose tea, so to speak, in your beverage, then you can strain this out with either a coffee filter or some cheesecloth, or a sieve will work as well. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to chop our lemon here in half, and we're going to take our bowl and we're going to squeeze our lemon juice into here. You can use a fruit juicer if you want, or you can just use your hands. We'll do the other half of this one. And then you can take a spoon, and we're going to use about 2 tablespoons or so of some lemon juice. Add that in. Again, a bit of an agitation. And before we add our honey, we will let that sit for a few more minutes. So, the reason why I picked most of these vegetables and herbs this evening is because they can all be easily grown in our backyards. Typically, especially if you're gardening for vegetables, you need a specific soil mixture, and they need a bit more water than what we would normally get in Southern California. The great thing about all of these here on our list tonight is that they grow wild all over our landscape, so they can thrive in the natural conditions that we have. And of course, for those of you who aren't in our location here in Orange County, I don't have them on the list tonight, but of course Orange County is named after oranges. We used to have hundreds and hundreds of acres of orange groves here. And we see Sadie's on tonight. Hello, Sadie. I hope you're having a good evening. Welcome to our show. And I figured that was for those of us that live here, a bit of a common fruit that we already know. So I figured we didn't need to dive too hard into it. So like I said, as our tea is steeping, let's start our discussion with fennel. So fennel is closely related to the licorice plant and the anise plant. It has been used for centuries around the world to flavor dishes and to be eaten just as it is as a vegetable. Typically, I've seen it, at least in my own life and experience, it's typically used in like Italian sausages and Mediterranean dishes. But you can actually eat any of the plant raw. You can take the bulb and you can cut up the bulb here, and that can be sauteed to be put in like a grilled vegetable salad. You can put it on a burger, you can eat it on its own. You could also chop it up raw and toss it in any fresh salad. And it'll add a bit of sweetness and a bit of a licorice slash anise taste to whatever your dish is that you're preparing. Fennel is typically very sweet. There are 2 separate variations. This bulbous variety you typically won't find growing in the wild here in California. If you live down here in Newport Beach, you can go for a stroll through the back bay that we have, and you can see quite a few bundles of this stuff growing up to about 5 feet out of the ground on the side of the path. And it actually smells quite nice walking past it. You get that nice waft of some fresh licorice. And yeah, it's used typically in American cuisine. It's used as an aromatic. It's used as an herb to just give a hint of flavor to something. In I believe Canada and in England, it is a core ingredient of making absinthe. So you get that sweet, sharp licorice flavor from the fermentation of the absinthe. And the wild variety typically doesn't have this bulbous end on it, so it's not usually as useful as a vegetable as you might use it in your own kitchen. But again, the rest of the plant, even the wild variety, you can use as an aromatic, as a grilled end for something if you wish. Lauren's asking, what is your favorite use for fennel? Honestly, I just like eating it raw. You can just take a hunk of this off. You can cook it, you don't have to, like I said, and it's actually very sweet. Initially I expected it to be a little bit bitter, and it almost has a sweetness likened to like a sugar cane, I think. If you have never tried it, I suggest picking it up for a bit. It's pretty good. I can't imagine it would go with too many dishes. You gotta be careful, it's quite strong. I've made the mistake at Thanksgiving dinners making stuffings that have some fennel in it, and you just get too much in there, and it can overpower a dish, so you do need to be cautious. So that's our fennel for our evening. Our second one here that I want to go over today is seaweed. Now this is just some store-bought seaweed. You can find this at pretty much any local market or grocer. If you go to any of the Japanese or Korean markets around town, you can find this stuff in bulk for pretty cheap. And interestingly, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that this type of seaweed is called nori. It's a specific type of algae. All kelp and all seaweed are of the same algae family, the same genus, and depending on where you are on the coast of California, you actually can harvest and forage for it on your own. Now, taking into account that all of this stuff will grow wildly, you do need to make sure you're not taking any plants off of private property or any state or public property. It typically is against the law, but depending on your area, you can call your local authorities and ask and say, hey, is it fine if I take something from this piece of land? If you are in a national forest, I do know that there is typically a few regulations for edible plants in national forests that you can take small amounts of for your own personal consumption. So if you happen to be on any trips and you happen to go through foraging, you can go ahead and see what's available to you there. And an exciting thing with the seaweed, unfortunately, due to just city runoff and ocean pollution, just walking out to the beach and grabbing some kelp off the coast and letting it dry out is not the ideal way to go about foraging for this on your own. I did find a handful of organizations in Los Angeles and San Diego and Central California that will actually take you on a day trip to go foraging for your own seaweed. And seaweed also has tons of health benefits. I think it's kind of ironic that our friends across the Pacific Ocean in Japan have found dozens and dozens of uses for seaweed. It's in many of their cuisines, and we share the same ocean, we share a lot of the same plants in the South Pacific, and we don't see a lot of seaweed in our cuisine here. Seaweed is basically a jackpot of nutrients. There's tons of vitamin A, there's tons of vitamin B, there's a lot of calcium, and there's also a lot of iodine and potassium. Iodine is something that Americans typically struggle to get enough of in their diets. That's also why we have stuff like Morton's iodized salts, where you can get your iodine from your salt sources and other areas of your diets. But seaweed's a great way and simple way to either use it as a snack, dip it in some soy sauce, put it in some soup, or you can even buy some fresh seaweed, make a salad, and you get a lot more nutrients in a pretty compact package. So I highly recommend it. I think it tastes great. You can also buy small packages of it for snacking that have different flavors, wasabi flavored, just salt and peppers, there's some like garlic and herb ones. But you also could just simply make your own and break some of this up and put your own seasonings on it and add a twist. And real quick, back to our tea here. I'm gonna go ahead and take out our sage leaves. And I'm gonna add about a tablespoon or so of honey into my tea here. Get these last two chunks out. I think there's one all the way in the bottom. There we go. We'll go ahead and open up our jar of honey. Now, sometimes if you're making tea with any fresh herbs, it can initially be a bit bitter. That's also true of a lot of just fresh vegetables, especially you might find it true if you're gardening at home with kale or spinach or some lettuce varieties. That they do initially taste very bitter depending on the environment they've grown in and how much time they have had to get to their mature state to where you pick them. And a great way to reduce the bitterness of your vegetables is simply blanch them. Blanching is boiling a large pot of water and just dipping in whatever vegetables you have for maybe 30 seconds, a minute, enough that it will release some of those more intense flavors into the water. And then when you take the vegetables out of the water, you have less of that bitter flavoring in the vegetable. And then you can cook with it as you typically would with anything else. Throw it in a dish with whatever you're cooking for the night. So just a bit of a tip there. And let's see how our tea tastes tonight. It's actually very refreshing. If you're cooking along with it at home, the lemon does help a lot. I have made this previously without the lemon juice, and it is a little bit sharp and it's a bit strong of an aromatic scent in it as you put your nose in the cup to drink it. But I think sage tea is great just in the mornings. For me, it really helps me wake up if I don't want to just have a plain glass of water. So tea is usually the way I'll go if I'm not having coffee that day. But yeah, let's get back onto our local talk on plants. So seaweed, you can usually see it most of the year. You'll see it floating around in the ocean, or if you happen to go to the beach frequently, I'm sure you've seen it in the summertime when the swells push a lot of the seaweed that's broken off the bottom of the ocean floor onto the beach. If it just sits there and isn't drying out efficiently, it can start to smell pretty unpleasant and occasionally makes a bit of a mess on the beach. But it is something that simply you could go out, especially if you go out with a guide that will take you, and you just cut enough of the plant off that you want to take home. You can lay it out in the sun on a towel or even like a clothing rack, and in about an hour to 2 hours it is typically dried, and then you can cut it into whatever pieces you need. You can salt it, you can eat it right away, whatever you wish. And another plant that we typically, especially in American gardening, view as a weed is dandelions. I know part of that is because they grow rapidly and their seeds spread everywhere, so if you do have them in your yard, they tend to kind of take over a little bit. I see we have a question of what sage are you using? This is what you would call common sage or green sage or culinary sage. It's the typical variety that's sold in the grocery stores is going to be green sage. It usually has the least amount of bitter flavoring in it, and it's the most effectively cultivated type or part of the genus for the plant that is just easily available and easily grown and sustainably grown. We'll get into that a little bit later about a couple other types of sage that grow all over the mountainsides here in Southern California. But our dandelions, as I think a lot of people aren't aware, I didn't know this, the entire plant is actually edible, from the seeds to the flowers to the stem to the roots of the plant. In Old England, during, I believe, the Renaissance period, dandelions were typically seen as actually a bit of a royalty of food. They were used in salads, and I would equate it similarly how we might equate kale about maybe, I don't know, the kale craze was maybe 5-6 years ago. It was kind of viewed in that way, as this, quote, superfood in a way. But you can make a tea with the leaves. You can make a yellow dye with the yellow leaves of certain varieties, typically the ones we have here in Southern California. You can actually just grind those up in a mortar or pestle, and you can get a yellow dye out of it. And something that surprised me is that the sap inside the dandelion, if you were to pick a plant, say off the sidewalk, and you were to cut it in half, usually a white white liquid will come out of the center of the stem, and that actually is a natural form of latex. And there aren't too many ways that we get natural rubbers in the world, and farming dandelions is far from the most efficient way to get natural rubbers. But it is something interesting that I learned that is not typical of a lot of plants we see that grow just wild on our sidewalks and our driveways. I see a comment from Sadie. I like to use sage with butternut squash. Yes, sage has this wonderful peppery, slightly sharp flavor to it that pairs so well with really anything sweet, I find. Especially butternut squash. If you cook it at the right temperature for a set amount of time, you get that nice, sweet, caramelized, almost baked flavor out of it. And sage goes really, really well, like with a butternut squash ravioli, or even just you make a sage butter, brown some butter, drop some sage leaves in it, let them wilt slightly and brown, and just pouring that over a butternut squash can add a huge amount of flavor to something that might be already a single flavored dish. So it's very useful in so many different avenues of how we prepare our food. And a less common fruit that I rarely see in grocery stores, I'm kind of surprised. This typically isn't available or in season until late summer, early fall. It's actually prickly pear fruit. In Southern California, we have cactuses everywhere, or cacti, if you want to use a proper plural for them. And for the most part, almost all the flesh and flowers and occasional fruits of cacti are edible. The prickly pear fruit you will usually see growing on the tops and sides of the oval, I guess I might call it, walls or edges of the cactus itself. If you're not sure or unaware of what prickly pear cactus is a very common cactus that we have here in Southern California. It grows all over the place. It's almost invasive at times at how large these plants can get. And we have quite a few of them on our back bay here, so if you're going for a stroll, you can see them. They are covered in large spines, and the fruits, there's a specific way you do need to remove them. You can harvest them if you have them on your own property, or if you are allowed and have permission from private property or any state park or anything to harvest them. You can harvest the fruits from when they're a bit early of ripe, they'll be green, and when they're later in the ripening, they get this beautiful ruby pink color. And they're very commonly used in Mexican cuisine. And in Spanish, I do not know the word for tuna in Spanish. If any of you do and you want to put it in the chat, please go for it. But they call it tuna in Spanish because of the same pink color that fresh tuna meat has. It's that same rich, deep red pink color. And the flavor of the prickly pear fruit tends to be extremely sweet. I found it to taste almost like a very condensed watermelon. The texture of it's potentially a bit mushy. It's not quite as firm as a watermelon, but the flavor can just honestly be delicious. It can be used in smoothies. You can chop it up and put it in a salad. You can cut the fruits in half and throw them on the grill and put them on burgers. You can put them in almost anything. And they'll typically be available in the stores, again, late summer. So if you're interested, you can look for them then. If not, you can probably look online for a few farmers markets. I know farmers markets around here in Costa Mesa tend to have varieties of fruits and vegetables that we don't always get in our traditional over-the-top markets here, our grocery stores. And when you're harvesting the fruit, there are also a lot of very, very fine hairs that are almost like splinters all over the fruit. So typically you would use quite thick gloves and a few towels likely, and a knife. If it's not quite ripe, you can twist and cut the fruit off of the cactus body. If it is quite ripe, a simple twist of the wrist would break the fruit off. And to get rid of all of those splinters on the end, you can either roll them around on like pavement, or if you have like a cutting board or something at home, you could rub them on that and it will break the splinters off. What I've seen done actually is they'll put the fruits on the end of a skewer and stick them over a fire, and they will just burn away all of those prickly hairs on the outside of it. And then once it comes out of the fire, you can take a knife and cut the flesh of the fruit, almost like you'd be peeling, say, a grapefruit or maybe a tangerine. And you just peel the skin off, and you have this delicate, delicious, rich pink fruit inside. Like I said, which can be used in multitudes of things. It can even be used in smoothies. I've seen it used in cocktails as a flavor enhancement for a cocktail. And just tons of applications that I think, unfortunately, since so much of it grows around here, it doesn't come up in our cuisine very much, which I think is a shame, because I find a lot of joy and interest in seeing what we have around us and what resources we have that grow at our feet that would easily be attainable to cultivate in our own homes, to grow in our own backyards. And it just, I think, really can help connect us with what these foods have, what sustenance these foods have provided for people who lived on this land for hundreds and thousands of years. We're a bit disconnected, I think, in the West with just our general cuisine, where a lot of our food that we get is imported. A lot of foods that we have, right, that might be influenced by Mediterranean cuisine because we have similar climates here, they're delicious in their own right, but we don't necessarily have the same availability of fish and seafood. It's not as common as it might be in, say, Italy or South Greece or South France or even South of Spain. So yeah, it's a bit of a fascinating facet of this for me. And then one of the big things, I use sage as a tea for tonight for a purpose. Sage has been used in many cultures throughout the world for a variety of reasons. The family of the genus of sage, so that is the variations of this specific plant in nature, is very, very large. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of variations of the sage plant itself. They're typically labeled by what color flower they produce. The local sage that we have here in Southern California is white sage. That is partly true because the leaves of the plant are a gray, blue-white color, but the flowers that the plant produces are also typically white. Occasionally you'll get a lavender-colored variety, but usually a local white sage, the flowers will be white. With your typical your culinary sage, the flowers are typically blue or purple, and there are also a couple variations I've seen that I've cooked with that are multicolored sages. So the leaves will be yellow and green, almost like a golden yellow color. Occasionally you'll find sages that are white and green, and they all have slightly different flavors and textures, and the size of the leaves vary. And I think it's so great that we can get so much variety out of quite a simple plant. And the unfortunate flip side of how wonderful this plant can be is that in recent years, I want to say I started hearing about this, at least in the American white end of culture, maybe 8, 9, 10 years ago. But there's a Native American spiritual practice called smudging, and smudging typically uses white sage. And a lot of native cultures, they regard sage as a sacred plant, a sacred herb. It has lots of medicinal properties. It can be antiseptic, so if you get a cut, similar to like aloe being used on sunburns, there are compounds in these plants that can help fight off bacterias. But the act of burning sage in a ceremonial setting has been used for thousands and thousands of years, and it has been at times inappropriately and at times appropriately co-opted by our modern culture, and for good reason. It has a great use in actually cleaning the air around us. There were a couple of studies I found one that was done by, you can find this study in the Journal of Clinical Pharmacy and Therapeutics. And they did a study on a sealed room, and they took the smoke from a sage plant and filled the room with that smoke. And they also had placed a bit of bacteria in the room, and they found the bacteria count in the room reduced by 94% before and after they exposed the room to fairly high amounts of sage smoke. Now that's been touted during all of these COVID times as it having antiviral properties. I did not find any of that in my research. And as a bit of a disclosure, none of this information is necessarily a medical information, so to be used for you at home. If you want to look into it, do your own research. Any type of smoke inhaling is not good for your lungs, so be aware of that if you happen to be burning any of this at home. That having windows open is usually a good idea, just to help clean all of that residual ash and air out. But back to our white sage and its native uses. It has unfortunately had a boom, which is good in terms of our awareness of this plant and its uses in our communities. But the boom has led to people illegally taking this plant off of private land, off of reservation lands, off of state property, even national property. And what I find kind of funny about that is, since it grows everywhere in Southern California, and we're in Southern California, you can go to your nursery. You can even go to an online nursery, and they will ship this plant to your doorstep. So you could grow it on your balcony in a small pot. You could grow it into a large bush in your backyard. Last spring, I started a garden during COVID on my small apartment balcony, and I actually had several of these sage plants. I did grow the green sage, specifically because I wanted to start cooking with it. But that's a very easy fix for just taking things in our own hands. And I think it provides an opportunity when we ask some questions about, what are these things growing around us and how can we use them? We have the ability to, or the opportunity rather, to then actually look into how these plants have been used before us, how these plants have been intended to be used for centuries and generations. And that can lead us to, I think, really interesting conversations with different people, with different cultures. It can get us more connected into our own land. I typically, you're driving down the road and you don't pay attention when you're driving to all of the stuff along the side of the road, all the plants, all the trees. You're trying to get to your destination. But just going for a walk around your neighborhood, the next time you're out, take a chance to just pay attention to the tree growing in someone else's front yard. Pay attention to maybe even that odd branch hanging over from your neighbor's yard into your backyard. And there are a handful of apps that you can get for your phone or even your computer. It's much easier on your phone though, that you can take a photo of said plant, and they have a database registry that will compare the photo of the plant you took with their database and give you a typically accurate depiction of what exactly that plant is, if it's edible in the first place, if it's poisonous, all the information you could want about that one plant. And I think that's just such a great thing that we can do if you're just going for your afternoon stroll, if you need a bit of exercise. It can make going outdoors a little bit more interesting. I know after this past year of being a bit cooped up, it can be hard to get some of that motivation back, to want to go outside, to want to actually get moving again. We've been, sitting inside for so long that I think becomes a bit habitual. And learning about what grows outside our front door, I think, can be a great boost of creativity and energy to help us just live a little bit of a better, healthier lives and get back into a comfortable swing of things, and hopefully build a bit of understanding and a bit of comfort in our outdoors as we're adjusting to our new normals. So if you've joined me and you've made a tea of some kind along with me, I hope you've been enjoying it for the evening. I sure have. This tastes so good. I'm gonna have to make this more often than I thought. But I would really encourage you to do some of your own research. These 5 plants are a very, very small number of the plants around us that are edible, that you can grow in your yard, that have benefited different cultures and different generations for farther back than probably most of human history can have account for. And there's a reason that a lot of these plants have been used either as foods or as medicine. And unfortunately, and if any of you have information on this, please send it to any of the emails on our Harvard website, because I would love to know more about this as well. But there isn't a ton of scientific study into a lot of what we would call medicinal herbs. And I think that's a shame, because there's a lot of these plants that have been used for such a long time. And modern science has come so far, and we are able to find the root causes and the properties of so many things, and it's wonderful. And yet, in doing a little bit of research, there's just a lot we don't know of something that I think in a simple way could be easily discovered. And just for an example, as a medicinal property that sage has, which this study very much surprised me, we have a comment from JJ, the wedding planner. Our children's group is learning about a lot of these similar topics. Yes, I love that. Honestly, I think every elementary school needs to have a garden where the kids learn to tend to it. You get them outside for an extra 45 minutes a day. They play in the dirt. They get to be kids, and they get to learn about, their own environment and what they're putting in their own bodies. And I think that is just so valuable and can make life just so much more vibrant and interesting. And I saw a comment earlier that I believe was, I can't remember who it was from, but it mentioned that sage was on the conservation list. Yes, it is not endangered yet. There we go. Tyler put it back up for me. I didn't know that it was on the conservation list in Arizona, but yes, it grows all over the southwestern United States. You'll find this stuff in Nevada, you'll find it in Arizona, you'll find it in New Mexico, you'll find it all over northern Mexico. It grows almost everywhere. But like I said, it's not quite endangered, but at the rate it is currently being, unfortunately, torn out of the ground, a lot of people are starting to pay a bit more attention, and the conservationists especially are paying attention to how much of this is getting torn up and not properly replanted or properly just grown in similar ways that we grow our culinary sage. White sage has just been ripped up and sold on Amazon, sold on Etsy shops, and it's one of those things that is important to look back to. Again, where does our food come from? Where are we sourcing things? It's, I think, one level of seeing where's what we're sourcing things coming from to protect the environment. I think on a more relatable side, that's not as potentially abstract for some people. We can look at this as we are people in a land that was not originally ours, and we are taking a sacrament from a culture that we don't have and cannot have a full understanding of. And we don't necessarily see, unfortunately, the impact and the potential lack of compassion that we can have for these communities that do value these plants, and us just ripping them out of the ground. A lot of people aren't paying attention to how is that affecting our other communities that we have around us, and is it being respectful to the other people that live and use our land in typically a more appropriate way than our suburban neighborhoods typically do. And another study that I had found in terms of health benefits of sage was, again, it was from the Journal of Clinical Pharmacy and Therapeutics, and they used a sage extract from common sage, so the same green sage, and they did a double-blind study with 42 individuals who had mild cases of Alzheimer's. And in comparison with their placebo group, they found that after 4 months of administering 60 drops of the sage extract a day, that the non-placebo, so the non-control group, found that they had significant positive outcomes in their cognitive function compared to the placebo group. And again, I wish there were more studies like this on plants in general. It's a wonderful thing that we have found ways to extract vitamins and minerals and nutrients out of plants and put them in a little capsule that you can go buy at the grocery store. But if you're eating the right things and you're putting the right things in your body as food, as sustenance, you don't need that multivitamin. Eating appropriate meals, you typically don't need to have those extra vitamins, because then you're usually consuming either more copper than we need, or more zinc, or too much iron. And those can lead to a lot of other complications and issues if it's consumed for extended periods of time when it is not necessary. And so yeah, I hope that some of this has sparked a bit of just that question of what is around me in my neighborhood, what is around me in my own yard, what is around me that's just every day when I'm walking down the street. And I see a comment from Lauren: old wives' tales and folk healing is fun to learn about too. Yes, there are lots of things in old wives' tales about a lot of plants that nowadays we have a better understanding of what was going on in someone's body when they ingested something. And so some of the old wives' tales about certain plants that were consumed for specific medicinal reasons can be quite funny in the explanations that were used for them. I know there's one about milk thistle, that if you have dried milk thistle around your necks, then it will scare away all of this, or cause the snakes that are in front of you to start quarreling. Like, I don't understand where that comes from, but it's, it kind of makes me chuckle and laugh a bit. What situations led to someone's writing down of consistency of, okay, well, this happened, and here's a correlation to this, and this must be the trigger, this must be the specific plant. Anyways, it's a fun tangent. If you want to get a laugh and have some questions on these things, I would highly recommend you Google old wives' tales about any medicinal herbs. There are countless books written on it. Some are satire, some are legitimate and serious, and actually have some science backing up a lot of these stories that we have behind these plants and herbs. But it's fascinating. The list goes on. Like I said, this is only 5 of hundreds and dozens of plants. There's fig trees that grow around here. We have kumquats that grow around here. There's so many plants from other places in the world that have been transplanted that are edible that we just pass by and don't even usually take a glance at or think about. So I hope that this has been somewhat educational. I hope this has piqued a bit of interest, or at least a bit of curiosity about just the stuff we don't see in the grocery stores, the stuff we don't typically look at or consume, yet usually has a lot of nutritional value, and it's just a lot of fun. There's plenty of groups online you can go find for outside foraging groups. There are a couple of school programs at the local universities that do foraging or have courses in foraging. If you call any of the local reservation areas for like the Back Bay or any of the state parks and things, they will sometimes do classes in the summer and early fall that are talking about foraging for any types of foods that are in that specific piece of land. And as we move forward post-COVID, I think that's a great way to safely be outside with other people, get some activity outside, get some exercise, some sunlight, and learn a few things that we otherwise probably wouldn't even think about sitting at home on our couches, not participating with our beautiful and wonderful planet that we live on. So thank you all so much for joining me tonight. A bit shorter of an episode this week, but I hope you all have a great, wonderful rest of your evening, and I hope you can join us on our next one at 6 p.m. the last Wednesday of next month. Thank you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful night.